So yeah, as Nick said, I'm going to talk this afternoon about apple maturity. How do we measure it? Why it's important, and then some of the kind of early post-harvest things. So that kind of first couple of weeks after we pick fruit and put them in storage, what are the things we need to be really aware of in those early days? And then at the end, I'm going to do a little bit of a follow up on the risk of internal browning in pink ladies this year. So like I've done for the last couple of years, I've had a look at the growing degree days, and we can kind of see how this year looks compared to some previous years, and what that might mean for the risk as we move into pink lady, particularly given that harvest maturity is such a factor for that disorder. It is Friday afternoon, so thank you everybody for giving up some time. Despite what Nick said, I will try and keep this much closer to half an hour than an hour. But for those of you who've seen me present before, sometimes I start talking and it's hard to slow me down. But with that, let's start talking about maturity. So just a bit of an overview. Like I said, I'll talk a little bit about the physiology of maturity and fruit development. What are the ways that we can measure maturity in apples? Some standard kind of guidelines, then early storage, particularly looking at cooling and exposure to carbon dioxide, and then a quick look at what the risk of internal browning looks like for pink lady apples this year. So I guess the first question to me is, why is maturity of apples and pears so important? And for a piece of fruit that we store for a fairly long amount of time, maturity at harvest is really one of the most important things to get right. Maturity at harvest is going to be one of the main drivers that will help determine how long the fruit is going to be stored, the different conditions that the fruit could be stored in. And then because of the combination of those two factors, it's also going to be a big driver in where that fruit can be marketed. Because if it can't be stored for a long time, or it can, and it can be stored in, say, long-term CA, then that's going to give you more flexibility or more places where that fruit can potentially go. In terms of maturity, there's really three big phases that we talk about from a physiology standpoint. So the first stage is fruit maturation. Maturation leads really without a super distinct boundary into fruit ripening. From ripening, we then move into senescence, and senescence is really just old age, when we've gone beyond ripe, and we're then in that period where we're decreasing in quality. The thing to really keep in mind when we're talking about maturity is that maturity is so closely linked to quality. A lot of people, and I'll do this myself, we will use the words interchangeably. So sometimes I say quality when I think maturity, because they are so closely linked. And the thing to really keep in mind is that quality is going to be at its peak when we pick that piece of fruit. And what's so important of getting that harvested at the right time is that's going to follow in through all of your post-harvest quality. We're generally not going to improve anything during that post-harvest period of time. It's all about trying to maintain things in that condition for as long as we can. So we need to make sure that maturity at harvest is really at peak. If we talk about what quality, and I've sort of put quality here in parentheses, because this can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, which could be different people in the operation. So in the field versus the pack house versus the marketing team. Quality can also mean different things to growers versus consumers. So there are some different ways that we need to talk about quality when we're thinking about apples. But if we generally look at this curve, this is a really kind of simplified way to look at apple growth and development and maturity. So this first stage, after full bloom, we've got our fruitlets, fruit are growing. We hit commercial maturity in this kind of stage. And then this is where we're peaking in our quality metric. After we've peaked in quality, the fruit will then decrease down in quality as the fruit gets over mature. Around about this point here, where we switch between maturation and ripening, is where the fruit is considered physiologically mature. So apples are what we call a climacteric piece of fruit, which means that ethylene is really closely related to how that fruit ripens and how it behaves during ripening, and things that we can do to manipulate maturation in apples. So physiologically mature for an apple is right about that time when the starch is just starting to break. So it's probably too early for what you would consider an eating quality apple, which is why it's a little bit lower down and not as high up on this scale. But it has that capacity to ripen after it's been picked. So if the fruit can ripen after it's been picked, it's considered to be physiologically mature. If we look at the fruit here, once we're in this commercial maturity window, the ones at that early side are going to be the ones that are the best maturity for long-term storage quality. As we head up and we peak at this quality side, these ones are going to be our best eating quality, our best maturity to go straight into consumption. And then as we go over that maturity hump, we end up with fruit that's over mature, and then fruit that's also prone to rots. If we look back again at this harvest window, it's really these fruit in this sort of position here, where we're just beyond physiologically mature. So we've got starch breakdown happening. So I see this as being a little bit beyond just that initial starch breakdown. So physiologically mature would be slightly starchier than our best quality for long-term storage. And as we move through maturation in this harvest window, we're seeing this breakdown of starch. Starch is really that storage ability for that piece of fruit. So it's the energy source for that apple to continue to respire while it's in storage. So a piece of fruit like this that has less starch at harvest compared to a fruit like this doesn't have a lot of fuel in the tank to go through a long storage period. Hence, fruit that are further up on this maturity scale are less able to be stored in long-term storage. Your best maturity for long-term storage is fruit that still have a lot of starch. In terms of how we measure maturity, there's a whole lot of different tools that are available, and most of them have some different pros and cons. So ethylene is probably the most accurate way to measure the physiological maturity of apples, and that's because, as I said, apples are climacteric and they produce a lot of ethylene during ripening. So because of that, if we're able to measure the ethylene production of fruit, we get a really nice signal of the physiological ripening. The challenge is we need one of these pieces of gear here called a gas chromatograph. These are pretty expensive. They're also not very handy out in the orchard. It's something we need to have on a bench in the lab and take the fruit to it. So while it's going to give us a very accurate measure of maturity, it's not the most practical tool. If we look at chlorophyll, there's quite a few different tools that are around the traps at the moment for measuring chlorophyll or other components of the fruit skin. We can correlate chlorophyll to maturity in a pretty nice way. Tends to work better in blushed varieties than unblushed varieties, although can be used in both. We do see chlorophyll break down. So chlorophyll will decrease as apples go from that early maturity to a later maturity. And the way we can kind of visually see that is as we see that background color change. So background color change is going to go from green to yellow. A lot of that change is due to the breakdown of chlorophyll. Starch pattern index is probably going to be the most familiar way with everybody on the call here. It's easy, it's cheap, it's relatively fast. Generally speaking, it correlates quite well to a lot of these other measures. And that's one of the things that we're really looking for in practical tools to measure maturity in apples, because we know we can have some really accurate tools, but when they're not practical, what we're then trying to do is find another tool that's a good kind of proxy. It fits in nicely, it's cheap and it's easy and it's portable, but it correlates well to something that we know. So starch does work very well. The biggest downside to starch, in my opinion, is that it's highly subjective. If you have different people looking at the same apple, we're often going to get different scores for that piece of fruit. It can also be fairly difficult to compare because there's a lot of different starch scales around. There can be different scales for different varieties. It's also pretty common that different countries use different scales. So if we're talking about starch as our indicator of maturity, it is really important to make sure that we're talking the same language, so that when I talk about a starch of 2, I'm talking about the same kind of thing that someone else is talking about when they're talking at a starch of 2, because on the different scales, they can mean quite different things. Historical averages, so using calendar dates is another tool that can work quite well. APAL growth and development does follow a fairly typical growth curve, and we do see not a huge amount of shift as we go from year to year. So it can give you a good indication, particularly pre-harvest, if we're trying to get an indication of when harvest might be and we're still kind of 6 or more weeks out. Looking at harvest dates from previous years can give you a good ballpark of when we think harvest might be. And then the last couple I've got here are a background color. So using a color chart is a way to get a reading similar to one of our chlorophyll meters, but like starch, it's going to be very subjective depending on who's giving that score. And then sugars or bricks is another indication that's, again, quick, easy, cheap, can be measured out in the field. The thing I think to keep in mind about measuring maturity is the best way to go about it would be to have multiple measures. Don't rely just on a single metric to look at. Combine a few different things together, and that's going to pull out some of the limitations of using, say, just starch. If we combine sugar, starch, and firmness, that's going to give us a pretty good indication together of the type of maturity of the fruit that we're looking at. In terms of sampling fruit for harvest maturity, and this is always a really nice discussion because there's some really good questions about what should you sample, where should you sample, and how many fruit should you sample. And to me, you need to kind of take a step backwards before you try and give an answer to those questions, because it really depends on what you want to know and what information you're trying to gather when you're taking a maturity sample is then going to tell you where you should select fruit and how many fruit you should select. So I've given a couple of examples here, but there's other things that you might want to be thinking about too when you're taking maturity samples of fruit. So if you want to know how mature are the most mature fruit, because maybe you want to know the earliest dates that you might need to be in that block and picking fruit, then where you would want to select fruit is where the fruit are most mature on the tree, which is generally going to be tops of trees and outer layers of the canopy. When we're taking samples where we want to measure things that are similar, I talk about consistent fruit. So you want to pick 10 fruit that are those kind of most mature fruit, because that's what, in this case, we're trying to look for. 10, I would say, is the absolute bare minimum. More fruit is going to be better, but obviously you need to find that balance point of how many fruit am I going to take in terms of just the fruit themselves, as well as the time and materials to take those maturity tests. There will be a sweet spot that works for you in terms of how big that sample is. I would just say 10 is the absolute bare minimum. On the other hand, you may want to know what the variability of maturity is in your orchard. So rather than wanting to know just the most mature or the least mature fruit are, you want to know what's the spread of maturity. So maybe how long is it going to take to pick this block, or how much time might I have between first and second picks? If you're looking for variability, then you need to sample pretty randomly, because you want to get as much different fruit as you can, as opposed to a selection of really consistent fruit. The other thing to keep in mind is when we're looking for variability, you're going to need to have a bigger sample. Again, here I would say 20 is the bare minimum. More fruit is going to be better when you're trying to get an idea of what the variability is. In terms of the things that you should avoid when you're sampling fruit for maturity, definitely outer rows, end trees, and unhealthy trees. You essentially don't want to include anything in your maturity study that's just a bit different to those standard parts of your block. And you don't want to include anything in your maturity sample that's atypical. unless, of course, that's what you're trying to figure out when you're doing your sampling. I haven't gone into the kind of nitty gritty of how we do maturity sampling because APAL's already got a really nice video on this. If you go to tinyurl.com/apple maturity, so I just made a quick shortcut link to it, you can see Mick Crisera do a standard apple maturity test using all those standard pieces of equipment and tests that you would probably normally do. Mick also talks about sample selection and things. So it's a really nice video to go and watch. If you don't want to use a shortcut link, just go and look on the APAL website and you'll find this video that really runs through step by step how to do this testing from a practical standpoint. So when we talk back about maturity again, and we're in that kind of middle zone of what we consider to be commercial maturity, we can kind of split it into three main categories. So we've got the fruit that we consider to be immature. So this is where we have very, very starchy fruit, not a lot of break. We've got fruit in that kind of Goldilocks middle zone. And then we've got fruit that are over mature. So if we see a little bit about some of the characteristics, because everything that we do with fruit in terms of growing and harvest and storage, there's always compromises. There's going to be positive points about picking early. There's also going to be negative points about picking early. And the same with optimal and over mature fruit. There's always going to be this balancing act of trying to figure out which things are things that we can deal with in our particular scenario, or which things are risks that we're willing to take in our situation. So immature fruit, obviously this fruit is very starchy. By being very starchy, it means it hasn't had time for that starch conversion to sugar to happen. So we're going to have poor taste because there will be less bricks. There's also less of the volatile development. So all of those chemicals that give the apple its particular apple-y flavor won't have had time to develop. Immature fruit can be prone to internal browning. Immature fruit can also be susceptible to superficial scald, which is that browning on the skin of the fruit that can happen. The skin in general in immature fruit tends to be fairly sensitive. So other than only superficial scald, we can see other skin disorders. Those are some of our down points, but this fruit, because it's got so much starch, it's got so much potential storage in there. It does have the longest storage potential, despite having sacrificing some taste and sugar. It will be the fruit that stores for the longest amount of time. Immature fruit were also, because they just haven't been on that tree as long, they're going to lack some blush. Immature fruit can also be a higher risk of carbon dioxide injury during storage. If we look at optimal maturity, so I like to think of it as that Goldilocks zone, we tend to have good flavor. It's not going to be as much sugar and volatile development as our over mature fruit, but we've had some starch conversion to sugar happen. We've had some of those volatiles really develop. So we're going to have good flavor, good firmness and texture, flexible storage. So this is where we can store long if we store in the correct way. But this fruit can also go into shorter term storage scenarios if that's what's desired. Fruit from this optimal maturity tends to also be in that sweet spot for disorders. So most disorders tend to either have a risk of either being picked too early or picked too late. The other piece that comes into most disorders is then how they're managed in the post-harvest environment. So if we're only talking about the field side here, then optimal maturity fruit will tend to be your lowest risk for disorders going into storage. With over mature fruit, there's all kinds of issues that we can get into here. So there's quite a lot of disorders that are going to be very closely linked to over mature fruit. So we can see watercore, internal browning, senescent scald are going to be our biggest, internal brownings twice. It is a very significant indicator for internal browning. We do see with over mature fruit, we're going to have less firmness and poor texture. So we get more of those mealy textures showing up faster in over mature fruit. Those volatiles that are the ones that we want to develop in our apples, we tend to have a switch from those nice apple flavors to those alcoholic, aldehyde, over mature flavors, aged flavors that we get with over mature fruit. We can get greasy skin, decay. Because we've got fruit that are softer, we tend to see more mechanical damage and bruising. And this fruit, because we've lost so much of that starch, there's just not a lot of energy there for that fruit to go into any moderate or long-term storage. So over-mature fruit is really only going to be able to stay in short-term storage. Now, I think the ideal thing is always that we're picking fruit off in that Goldilocks zone, but obviously everything is going to be that balancing act, and there's going to be times where that fruit doesn't come off at the time that the textbook tells us that it should come off. So when we're going into a season where we know that fruit maturity is something that we need to be on top of, the thing to really keep in mind is that the earlier that you know that maturity is not what you're expecting, the more tools you're going to have to try and change or manipulate the maturity of that fruit. So the best thing you can really do is to test early and test often, because by testing early, you'll see how quickly that maturity is changing over time, and you'll be able to see that harvest window and how the varieties or picks are going to fit in together as you go through your different blocks and through your different varieties. But if we don't know how that fruit is changing, you're going to have less ability to sort of manipulate that as you go through. So we can delay harvest maturity or slow down how fast that fruit is going through that maturity change. So plant growth regulators that are applied near harvest are going to be some of the best tools for that kind of scenario. So our harvester and retain plant growth regulators that we can apply in the orchard that can help slow down how fast that fruit is moving, and potentially give you additional time to get that fruit off while it's still in that nice Goldilocks zone before we tip over into that over-mature fruit. The other thing that's really important when fruit maturity is moving beyond your ability to really manage it is to make sure that what's going into bins is as consistent as possible. Because often what happens when we've got variable maturity in the orchard is we end up with variable maturity in bins. When we've got a lot of mixed maturity in bins, we then need to manage how those bins are being stored to get the best out of it. And if we've got over-mature fruit combined with optimal maturity fruit, those bins really need to be managed to the most mature fruit in that bin, which means you're not going to get the potential storage out of the optimal fruit that were there by having that variability. So in terms of post-harvest quality, it's important to think about what the goals are, and then how can we sort of manipulate or change those. So the main goals, once we've picked that fruit and we're going into this kind of early or extended post-harvest stage, is what are we trying to do? We want to supply fruit to customers with as little loss as we can. We want to have as much flexibility as we can to either hold or pack fruit depending on market conditions. We want to keep as much quality and prevent as many disorders so that we're not reducing our pack outs as time goes on. The way that we do this, number one, in a big way, is going to be this harvest maturity. So that's what we've been talking about for the last 15, 20 minutes or so. The next two ways that we have to really manipulate quality that we have in post-harvest conditions is going to be our storage temperature and our storage atmosphere. So I'm going to touch a little bit on both of those, because how we manage those, particularly during that first 6 to 8 weeks or so, is really critical to how much storage we can get out of those fruit. So in terms of how fruit are cooled in those first few weeks after harvest, the thing I wanted to touch on here is chilling injury. So storage temperature is obviously the biggest thing in the post-harvest side for keeping quality in fruit. So the faster we can get field heat out of the fruit, the longer our potential storage life of the apples is going to be. While apples are warm, they're going to be respiring, which means they're using up all those energy sources, and they're going to run out of energy faster the warmer that they're kept. We've generally got two different ways that we can look at managing cooling after the fruit's been picked. And that's going to be either rapid cooling or slow cooling. There's quite a lot of pros and cons to both types of cooling. So I thought we'd run through that fairly quickly. Rapid cooling obviously has a really high energy input. We need to use a lot of energy to cool down the fruit. But by getting that fruit as cool as we can, as quick as we can extend how long that fruit is going to be in cool storage for without losing firmness or quality as we go through time. We can increase disorder risk in susceptible varieties if we rapid cool fruit. So some fruit that are susceptible to chilling injury, so pink ladies are a really nice example. If we rapid cool a pink lady from field heat down to a temperature of 0.5 degree to 1 degree quickly, we can induce this kind of disorder here. With slow cooling, we have less energy input. We potentially can have less storage out of that fruit, but I think we've now got so many nice tools to try and keep post-harvest condition of fruit that's less of an issue now. And this is why commercially we see so much less rapid cooling than we used to see 15, 20 years ago. With slow cooling, we tend to see a lot less disorders, but with warmer fruit, we can see more CO2 developing in cool storerooms just because that fruit's respiring and that's where CO2 is going to come from. What slow cooling looks like, a typical kind of protocol for that would be rapidly cool to 5 degrees. So make sure you're getting all that field heat out. That is really important for post-harvest quality. Get some of that field heat out as quick as possible. Cooling to 5 degrees, we don't see any stress or induction of disorders in most apple varieties. The only one that I would say to be careful of would be Honeycrisp, which thankfully doesn't have much production here in Australia. Once you get that fruit down to 5, then you can cool from there at a much slower pace. So I would say a maximum of 1 degree a week, but even a 0.5 degree a week or less gives you that nice slow cool down over time until you get to your final temperature. And in those conditions of slow cooling, we see a lot less of these types of internal browning disorders. The other thing in early storage to really be very mindful of is carbon dioxide and the injury that we can see that occurs with carbon dioxide. So we can see injury on the skin or in the flesh of the fruit with carbon dioxide injury. And this occurs when we see higher than typical concentrations of CO2, which is always a really kind of fuzzy definition because what does higher than typical really mean? And it's something that is very difficult to define. But what we know is the fruit will have that exposure to CO2 during that early harvest or early storage phase, but we're not going to see any symptoms develop for a long time. Similar with some of the chilling injury, where the damage is done in that first sort of month to 2 of storage, but we won't see any of this sort of thing show up until maybe several months later. Generally with carbon dioxide injury and similarly also for chilling injury, it's not a one-off exposure or a one-off event. It tends to be an accumulation of exposure to lots of different levels of CO2 that are outside of the expected levels. The thing to really keep in mind with CO2 injury in particular is that the risk for CO2 is even higher when we're in a low oxygen environment. So oxygen provides a really nice buffer when we do see wavering levels of CO2. So if our oxygen is up at ambient, so around 20-21%, and we have some spikes in CO2, it's much safer than if our oxygen is down at 2% or lower, and we have variable CO2 levels. CO2 sensitivity is the highest right at harvest, and it decreases over that first 6 to 8 weeks. So once the fruit have settled down into long-term storage, we see a lot less sensitivity to CO2 events. But one of the challenges is that we see a lot of these exposures to CO2 in those first couple of weeks of storage. Often that's really tied to cooling. So if the fruit haven't been cooled rapidly, we've got CO2 being produced by fruit respiration. So if those rooms aren't being vented or if scrubbers aren't being used in the first couple of weeks of storage, then we can get buildup of CO2 in rooms, and that will result in this kind of injury. Most apples are fairly CO2 sensitive, but some more so than others. Pink Lady, Envy, and Fuji, and Braeburn, we just don't have a lot of that, are some of the more CO2 sensitive varieties around, where you do really need to be very conscious of what the CO2 levels are. And certainly don't assume that regular air storage rooms aren't building up levels of CO2 that can cause this kind of injury. So the last little bit here that I'm going to cover is a quick update on what the risk of internal browning in Pink Lady is going to look like. I'll skip over this pretty quickly, but just to say that we do have different types of internal browning in Pink Lady. And we know that there's a lot of different factors that are involved. This isn't just a one issue, one response disorder. Like most disorders, there's a lot of different things and they can all sort of interact together as well. We know that there's a lot of pre-harvest factors and post-harvest factors, and we need to really stay on top of all of them to ensure that we're minimizing the risk of this disorder showing up during storage. So the best way that we have to predict how much internal browning will show up in storage is to look at the growing degree days. So that's what's here on this axis, from full bloom to harvest. So on this chart, I've got data from 2018 through to this year. So I'll explain what this kind of looks like. So the last 7 years are in the purple, and I've averaged that all together. And then the yellow bars on here is kind of our highest and lowest that this region has experienced over the last 7 years. If, like me, you have trouble thinking much further back than last year, here's the 2024 season. If you want to think about where this season looks like it's going to fall compared to last year. So if you had a low risk year last year, then you can look at what this year is looking like and compare it to how you managed fruit last year, or what changes you might want to make to harvest maturity and post-harvest storage of these fruit. So I did this calculation last week. So the other thing to keep in mind is we're not at harvest of Pink Lady apples yet. So what I have here in the dotted bar is the accumulation of growing degree days between when I did this calculation last week and when we were picking Pink Lady apples last year. So this is kind of an indication here of how much our bar could continue to go up between now and when we pick our Pink Lady apples. So all that to say, for most of our regions, we're here above the line, which means we're at a risk of developing the radial type of internal browning in pinks. The Huon Valley is really our coolest apple growing region in Australia and our only region that's at risk of developing the diffuse type of internal browning. For all our other regions, the warmer our season is, so the higher we can get above this line, the lower the risk there is of this disorder developing during storage. So if we look at the Goulburn Valley, this is one of our lower risk regions for developing internal browning in pinks. It looks like we're still very much on track to be similar to or even warmer than last year, which would be a lower risk than what we saw in the 2024 season. And that seems to be pretty similar across the board. I think it's really only Northern Tassie and maybe a bit of Manjimup where we're looking to be potentially a bit cooler than last year, which would be a higher risk of browning in those regions. Lenswood was a pretty high risk region last year. They had quite a cool season. This year, they're looking to be significantly warmer. So Lenswood should see a lower risk of internal browning this year. I've tried to put that in a bit of a risk category for this year based on what that chart looked like, as well as that sort of potential accumulation that we're expecting to see in the next couple of weeks. So it is important to know there's still quite a lot that this can change. depending on that weather over the next couple of weeks. You can go to this link here. So again, it's a shortcut link of tinyurl/APAL GDD, because growing degree days is what we're modeling here. If you go to this website, you can put in your closest weather station and do this calculation yourself. So if you want to see how this changes as we get closer to Pink Lady harvest, that's something that can be done. The other thing to really consider is for each of these regions, I've picked a Bureau of Meteorology weather station that's sort of centered in that region, but we do see a really huge influence of microclimates. So while I've given a bit of a category to each of the regions here, individual orchards within those regions might have quite different values. So if you have your own weather station and you're generating this kind of data, this could be a lot more relevant to your orchard and your blocks than looking at a Bureau of Meteorology site like this one. If that's something you would like some help kind of digesting that data or how that calculation is done, please feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to run through that. I'm also happy to do this update across the regions as we get a bit closer to Pink Lady harvest. So in terms of optimizing for pink ladies, when we know that we have a risk of internal browning, there's a few things that we can do. Like everything else we've kind of discussed here this afternoon, there's a lot of compromises that we're making when we're picking fruit, and we're managing it, especially when we're start layering on complexities like storage disorders. With Pink Lady apples, the two main things we're going to look at is those pre-harvest conditions and post-harvest conditions. So this should really be a nice summary of the things that we've talked about this afternoon anyway, because for pre-harvest management for pinks, the biggest thing we can try and do is manage that maturity in the field. Over mature fruit is going to have the highest risk for developing internal browning. So like I said earlier, you want to check maturity early and check it often. The sooner you know there's a potential issue with getting that fruit off in that Goldilocks zone, the more tools you'll have to try and manipulate that maturity and get that fruit off in the ideal maturity. And then consistency, making sure we're removing as much of that variability in bins as we can. If we've got really variable maturity in bins, we're losing a lot of that flexibility of how that fruit is going to be stored and the opportunities that you'll have for marketing that fruit going forward. Post-harvest, so again, it's those things that we've talked about this afternoon. Temperature management, making sure you rapidly cool down to 5 degrees, but then go slow from there so that you don't induce this disorder. And CO2 management, making sure we're keeping CO2 below 1% as much as possible. And again, that we're monitoring it as early as we're putting fruit in rooms. Don't wait till we're going from air into CA to start looking at CO2. The other thing that's our biggest tool here is going to be inventory management. If we know we're in a high-risk season for our particular orchard or our particular location, and then potentially for whatever reason we've got fruit that's been over mature going into storage, that fruit will be at risk of developing internal browning. If we know that fruit is there, the best tool we have is time. So fruit that's going to be at higher risk should be the fruit that tries to get moved first, because you want to get that into the market before browning has a chance to show up. So from there, and I didn't go too far over my half-hour expectation. If you do want any more information, if you want to talk about climate at your particular orchards, please feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, happy to open it up to some questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Hannah. So just a reminder to anyone who's listening that there's the Q&A button down the bottom. Feel free to add a question in there, and I can sort of read that out to Hannah, and she'll be able to read it herself. So go ahead. I've got one. Given the season so far, Hannah, we're seeing a real range of maturity on the tree. You're seeing SPI maybe 4 at the same time as you're seeing no movement in some varieties. What would you be thinking is probably the best strategy there for growers to try to manage it?
Yeah, for sure. So especially with a lot of our multi-pick varieties, so galas and pinks, The best thing we can do when we've got variable maturity in the orchard is really make sure that we're select picking. So we know variability is going to be there, but we want to take any opportunity that we can to reduce the amount of variability once we're in storage. So if we've got fruit on the tree that already needs to be picked, to make sure that we're going through and doing a select pick and getting that fruit off, rather than kind of waiting till the whole tree is at a point where it can be stripped, because then there's going to be fruit in there that's over mature and it's just not going to hold up in storage.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the key thing that just came out for me was Gala and Pink Lady are multi-pick varieties. So obviously everyone is struggling a little bit and they want the strip pick, but if you're trying to store fruit long term, you really need to be multi-picking. Otherwise, you're probably going to open up a bit of a disaster on the other end, particularly when you're going for that really long-term storage scenario. Another one, with it being a hot and dry year, Hannah, what are we likely to see from a post-harvest disorder risk perspective, maybe on the other end of things?
Sure, yeah. So everything's always a bit of a compromise. So hot and dry can give us a few benefits, and it can also give us a few challenges as we go into the post-harvest side of things. So from a benefit side of things, potentially we'll see less rots going into storage, which is always nice when we've got hot and dry conditions in the orchard. But from a risk side, we're probably more likely to see sunburn. When we've got sunburn on trees, that can turn into sun scald in storage. So where we've got those lighter patches, yellow patches from sunburn, those can get that brown scald, or even it can go quite black in storage or following storage while the fruit warms up in the supply chain. The other thing with that is making sure that bins aren't sitting in the sun after they've been picked. I have seen some really nice demonstrations of sunburn on the tops of bins when fruit's being picked in these hot days, where you can get that sunburn not only on the tree but while the fruit's sitting on the top of bins. Bitter pit is another disorder that tends to kind of show up a bit in hot weather. That's going to be predominantly related to calcium, so we're going to have a bit of less nutrition movement around the tree when it's stressed from heat.
Cool. There's just been a comment come through, Hannah, around sort of CO2 management and loading rooms. Using lime is a good strategy. Obviously, sort of for those who aren't familiar, like using lime, we'll draw some out. I don't know if you want to comment on some of the other technologies.
Lime is a fantastic tool. So lime is a really great passive scrubber, so it absorbs CO2 out of the air. The thing that we need to keep in mind when we're using lime as a CO2 scrubber is it's all about air movement and that surface area to volume to make sure that we're getting as much of that lime exposed to the air of the room as possible. So I like to talk about what I call the lime radiator, because the quickest and easiest way to use lime in your rooms is to just kind of have a pallet and just throw it in at the end, but you're not going to get the bang for your buck out of that. The best way that you can use lime is to either have single pallets with a single layer of bags that you put on the top of your bins. It doesn't need to be on every stack, but just put them around the room to get some air movement through that. The other way that works really nicely is you build the radiator, so you have kind of a pallet and then a layer of lime bags, and then another pallet, a layer of lime bags, another pallet, so that you're really getting air movement through. I've been told that lime suppliers will supply half-filled bags, which is another really nice way to make sure that you're getting that high surface area and you don't end up with lime in the middle of your bags that's just not done any work for you. So you've just moved it around a few times, but it hasn't actually done a job. And do make sure, because I have seen this happen, if you're going to go with the quick and easy, put a pallet of lime in, make sure you take the plastic off the pallet, because if you're closing up how the air can move through the lime, you're really not going to get the benefit out of it. But it works a treat. It works better than, well, it's cheaper than a lot of CO2 scrubbers, but it does do a great job. You just got to figure out what to do with it afterwards.
Perfect. Thank you, Hannah. Another question coming through from Noel Mason. Where does fruit cell density and dry matter fit in regards to internal browning? I assume alluding probably to silate more so there. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, it's a good question, Noel. There's two different things that are going on there. So cell density is kind of one side of the equation, and then dry matter is sort of a different side of a different problem. So cell density can particularly be an issue when we're talking about some of those CO2 type injuries. So silate's one there, pink lady's another one. Generally what I see so the more dense the apple in general, the higher the risk of CO2 type injuries. And that's because it's harder for the gas to diffuse out of the fruit. The denser that piece of fruit is, it's just harder for CO2 to move through. We can see some links to this in the weather as well. So if we have a really cool early season, we tend to have fruit with a higher cell density, which then does often result in fruit with more incidence of those types of injuries in storage. And then we've got fruit that just by their genetics are heavier, denser fruit. So like your silates compared to like a gala, that's a really light, airy fruit that's really easy for gases to diffuse through. So dense fruit, heavy fruit, those are going to be ones with challenges. Dry matter is a really nice indicator for maturity as well, because dry matter is really closely related to bricks. So dry matter is really going to give you a lot for consumer eating experience, and it can be really nicely modeled to disorder risk as well, where the higher the dry matter, we tend to see a lower, well, it's always a bit of a sweet spot with it as well. But if you're in that outside of the boundaries, so too low or too high, we're going to see disorder risk.
Absolutely. So there's just another comment there from David Finger around, lenticel damage. So you touched on bitter pit, but obviously with a hot, dry season, we're probably going to expect to see more lenticel breakdown in various forms. And his other comment there is just, where people are dipping, they may want to be really careful about their choice of product and what they're using in there. I don't know if you want to touch on that as well, Hannah.
Yeah, for sure. So we did some studies quite a few years back looking at lenticels and skin characteristics in general of apples. And one thing that apples really don't like is when there's rapid change. So if you've got apples that have been hot and dry out in the field, and then you put them very quickly into a cool, humid environment, the lenticels tend to get, as David said, very distressed. And you can get those lenticel issues showing up. So that's where we get browning around the lenticels and just kind of general lenticel damage. And then as David's pointed out there, which is very correct, once we've got sensitive lenticels in storage, we need to be really careful what things we expose those to. So again, temperature shock. If we've got cool fruit that goes into a water dump that's warmer, and I think the buffer is about 5 degrees. If we've got more than a split of that in the temperature difference between the fruit and the dump water, you can shock the lenticels and cause damage. And then the more things that are in there. So if we've got sanitizers, soaps, cleaners, all those things that are in there, each one of those products is going to agitate those lenticels a little bit more. And the more things we expose them to, the more sort of risk we have of getting lenticel damage.
Yep. And there's just another question come through, Hannah, around dipping and whether fruit should be put into rooms wet or dried off.
Yeah, good question. I think generally speaking, you don't want to put a whole heap of water back in your cool store room. So the standard practice would be to let them dry and then put them in your cool store.
Cool. If there's any last questions, I've got none in front of me at the moment, so get typing quite quickly. But I guess just some quick little notes that I've taken as we've been going through. So minimising variability in the bin is a major. We know there's variability on the tree this year. High temperatures in a lot of regions have been a bit of a challenge, particularly outside netting. So I think the answer there was multi-picking to manage that, or move the fruit as if it is the worst fruit in the bin. So where you have fruit where you know it might have a few issues, probably don't plan on opening that room up after Christmas would be a very good idea. or making sure that it's segregated. So whether it might be dropping some fruit with a little bit of that sort of sun tinting, bleaching kind of look to it. And the other one was just monitoring and managing that carbon dioxide level as well as that rate of cooling. You know, don't look when it's too late and realise that you've choked out the room with a heap of CO2. Monitor it and actively manage it, whether that's with lime or scrubbers or just venting rooms. But it's really important to manage that, or brown fruit is unfortunately likely to be the reality. Was there any other comments from you, Hannah, as I guess final touch points before we let everyone go?
Yeah, and I think you've hit the important ones there, Nick. I think just to reiterate, start looking at your maturity maybe earlier than you think, and just be checking maturity early and check it often. It can move quite quickly, and it will move in different patterns with different varieties. And we get some hot days or things in there, and it can run away from you quicker than you expect. So just if we're not checking, we won't know. So start checking.
Absolutely. We're seeing it, you know, things are moving relatively quickly, at least here in Victoria, where I am, and up in even into Batlow. You know, when things are moving, they're moving quick, particularly on that fruit that might be a little bit more mature on the tree. It's a good year for skim picking, I think, is probably worth considering for a lot of people. And watching earlier, a lot of guys are saying 10 days ahead. That won't necessarily translate all the way through the season, but it is so critical to be monitoring each individual block. If you've got a block that's got maybe a 2/3 crop on it, it will move fast. And if the hot weather sticks around, which it seems very persistent on, it's something to really watch. It's annoying to do. I think everyone can understand it takes time, but it is so important for your outcomes on the other end. So with that, unless there's any more questions, which are probably Hannah had put her email on there. Otherwise, you can find it. If you can't, contact APAL or myself, and I will get it for you, because she loves questions. And then, yeah, thanks everyone for coming. We will share these slides and the recording of today for anyone who might have missed out. And then we'll go from there. So thanks again, and good luck for the rest of the season.